people think the Marvel superheroes arrived with the recent big budget films like the Avengers. I forgot that was attached to the original theme. Here we are. So yeah, to the mass public, this is when the Marvel superheroes arrived. But the way they really arrived on the American pop culture scene was 49 years ago, around this time of year, when Esquire magazine featured them, the first consumer magazine to have a spread about comics, Marvel comics, and how they were reaching a more adult audience. And they actually got Jack Kirby to do the illustrations for that Esquire article in '66. Notice the headline, "Now You're Smart Enough for Comic Books." But why do you think, out of all the characters that Kirby was working on at Marvel in 1965 or so when this was done, was Captain America in the center there? How did Captain America get to be the de facto leader of the Marvel Comics universe? Well, you got to go back to his very first appearance. How did Captain America go from here, in his first appearance in the spring of '41, to here in Kirby's mature style in 1969? That's the art that's behind this portrait of Kirby, maybe my single favorite portrait of Jack Kirby, because to me, everything he was about, that look, that attitude, the power, the innate power inside the human exterior. But this theme is about Kirby, also the veteran. Kirby the army guy, Kirby the guy that served in Patton's army. So how are Kirby and his co-creation with his partner, writer-artist Joe Simon, how did this whole thing happen? That's what we're here to discuss in this Kirby Museum show that I've called Cap and Jack, which is about Jack Kirby and Captain America. And I'm Arlen Schumer. Nice to meet you all. I think I've known you all. If there's any newcomers here, nice to meet you. This is the invitation I put together. I call it, "What if Ira Schnapp had lettered a Marvel Comics ad?" If anybody knows or has been to my Ira Schnapp recent show, he was the great DC Comics letterer. But what I like to do as a graphic designer and illustrator working with comic book graphics is always go back to the source of the imagery that I use. So obviously I use that classic Kirby Captain America icon box in this issue from April 1968, that I also used one of his many great logos that appeared on this cover. The other logo from a year later that people recognize as Captain America is that cover, and of course that's the one behind here. Kirby gets his start in the 1930s doing in-betweens as a cell animator for Popeye, the Fleischer studio. Now, this is happening in the late 30s. That's Kirby's first professional work before he gets the comics. Here, around the time of Popeye, is a photograph of a New York City newsstand in the spring of 1938. Why is this significant? Look at the bottom row. What do you see? But of course, the first appearance of Superman in Action Comics #1, which kicks off the whole superhero crusade. In 1940, Superman's an overnight success. Look magazine creates a feature where they hire Siegel and Schuster, the writer and artist of Superman. In the wake of World War II happening all around them, people were saying, why can't Superman help fight the war and fight the Nazis? So they commissioned Superman in this weird two-color sequence in 1940 for Look magazine for how Superman would end the war. Years later, DC reprinted it and colored it. But here is the sort of, by proxy, Superman actually choking Adolf Hitler. Now, this was a far cry from what was actually happening in World War II in Europe, where images like this didn't even surface until years later. But stories about the mass killings of Jews as the Nazi war machine spread across Russia in 39 and 40 were seeping back to America. And two young American Jewish comic artists, Jaime Simon, who changed his name to Joe, and Yaakov Kurtzberg, who changed his name to Jack Kirby, were doing comics, and they were hearing stories about what was going on. But they were doing the early superheroes of their partnership together. Simon was a writer, editor, an artist, and inker. Kirby was a storyteller, an innate writer, penciler, inker. All of their work they did together. You have to be a Kirby aficionado to really detect who did what on particular pieces of artwork. But after they had knocked around the comic book world for the first couple of years, 38, 39, 40, they decide that they want to create a superhero, represent America, that would raise the consciousness of isolationist America in 1940 and 41, that didn't want to go fight what they call Europe's war, and they certainly weren't going to fight a war to save the Jews. So, two American Jews create Captain America. In the spring of 1941, the first issue is published. But hold on a second. A year earlier, in January 1940, this character, the Shield, is created. Now, we don't really know for sure if Simon and Kirby literally stole this. I mean, it was a small community back then. Look at the similarity between the Shield and Captain America a year later, and look at his triangular shield. The difference being is that he's actually punching Hitler, not even just choking him like Superman did. You know, recently Michael Chabon did his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about the early years of comics, Cavalier and Clay, and their character, the escapist, is punching Hitler on the cover in a direct homage to Captain America 1. So here's that splash page, and you know, it's interesting. This image has been used by Joe Simon. Supposedly it's a total Simon drawing, not Kirby, to prove that he created Captain America wholly, and then Kirby came on and worked with him on the character. But there is talk that maybe this image was created by Simon years later and basically post-dating it to make a claim that he created it. Because this image has made the rounds in comic book history. This was the second comic convention I went to in New York City, and Joe Simon must have been a guest, and they used the art. So here's his note down below to Martin Goodman, the publisher of early Marvel Comics, all about his character, Captain America. But here's the origin story that you might be familiar with, because if you've seen the movies, of course, but if you know the comics, this is early Kirby and Simon. I never liked early Kirby Simon artwork, but this is what was Captain America. He gets injected with a serum, just like Superman and all the early superheroes. They all stole from Philip Wiley's science fiction novel, The Gladiator, that appeared, I think, in 1933 or 31, I'm not sure. And he's about a man who gets an injected serum and becomes a super being. So, you know, Kirby was a voracious reader. The young comic artists were all science fiction lovers, so that's probably where they got this from. And of course, he bulks up and becomes Captain America. Here's the next page where the Nazi spy shoots and kills the scientist that creates Captain America. Again, this is a sort of comic book version of the real murders that were happening in Europe at the time. So somehow, through osmosis, subconsciously, unconsciously, what was going on seeps in to the very DNA of Captain America itself. And here's his first appearance in the comic book, in his costume, in this page that Kirby draws. And again, Kirby, Simon, whatever, let's just call it Simon Kirby. But that's our first appearance of Captain America. Here's the last page of the origin story, and right away, they want kids who are reading these comics to join the Sentinels of Liberty. Now, right around the corner here on the Lower East Side, where Yakov Kurtzberg was raised, is this building with this engraved logo for the
Boys Brotherhood Republic.
And that was a boys' club of like civics and ethics, and Kirby grew up around this. And it's interesting that the logo itself of Timely Comics, which is what Marvel Comics were called, that basically Captain America helped put them on the map, is also that similar shield. Now here's the Superman of America that appears right from the get-go when Superman's created. So obviously the Captain America guys were just, you know, doing what Superman was doing successfully. Now it's interesting that this ad that appears in issue 1, Captain America Wants You, well, of course, Captain America is the 20th century version of the mythological Uncle Sam. And it's interesting that off of the internet I found this art, which was either created to tie in with the first Captain America movie from a couple of years ago, where they actually dramatized what actually happened in 1941 because Captain America was an overnight success. They dressed up actors to stunt for war bonds. So the movie actually dramatized it, and that's one of the things that made the movie cool, is that this actually happened. Now it's interesting, right around the same time there was also a Captain Marvel cereal, and that's how successful Captain America was right out of the gate. I think, you know, those first 10 issues that Simon and Kirby did, what did they sell, like 1 million copies? Some incredible number back for even then was unheard of. But right away in Kirby's art, you see what becomes a signature element of how he breaks the picture plane and breaks the panels. This is all from the very first issue of Captain America. Look at how he actually makes the panel borders a stair-step-like design as he breaks the plane. And, you know, notice how the editors, somebody had to come in because they were worried that we wouldn't know how to go from here to here to here, even though that's how our eyes naturally follow. But that's the editorship back then. They were worried about stuff like that. Now, Kirby had also worked with Will Eisner, the young Will Eisner, in 1938, 39, something like that. This is early Spirit. This is the second week in June 40. But already you can see Eisner breaking the picture plane and what he does in these couple of panels. But Kirby, unlike a lot of comic artists who were influenced by Eisner years later, Kirby shows the Eisner influence right off the bat, almost at the same time Eisner is doing his seminal work. Look at all the ways that he breaks the picture plane. I mean, do you believe they actually felt they needed to tell us to follow the action? Thanks a lot, Jack must have thought. I mean, these pages, I mean, look at this kind of almost circular effect that Kirby creates. The weird jagged panels again, but the motion, the energy. Years later, 20 years later in the 60s, when Kirby hits his mature style, he would do the same things that I'll show you a little later on in the presentation, using his mature style, but with the same kinetics and energy that he displays in the very first issue of Captain America. I mean, look at that explosion. He's trying for that three-dimensional effect that 20 years later he would perfect in one of many Kirby explosions. But look at how he's using characters and figures to break the picture plane and the panels right off the bat. Now it's interesting, they call this villain in the first issue a rat called the Toad. Well, in that first issue was the debut in this kind of wacky look of, you know, Captain America's Dr. Doom. Of course, he precedes Dr. Doom. You could say Dr. Doom was the Fantastic Four's Red Skull because the Red Skull debuts first. And look at his power originally is that the mask actually makes people almost scared to death, like the Batman villain, the Scarecrow, who was created, I don't know, 1941, so who knows. But, you know, which came first again. And he takes care of the Red Skull the same way as all the other guys. Look, punching him right across the panel became a hallmark of Jack Kirby, and that was all just in issue 1. This becomes an immediate sensation to the point where it has ripple effects all through the early comic industry, where everybody is punching and beating up Hitler, like the early version of Daredevil that Marvel Comics got the rights to 20 years later in the 60s, and that's the Daredevil you know. But there was knockoffs of Captain America right from the get-go. Minuteman, produced by Fawcett Publications, that were successful with Captain Marvel. Then you've got Captain Battle. And these are all, you can say, cheap knockoffs of what only Kirby and Simon did the best. Here's issue 2, also about to pounce on Hitler. And this is how successful Captain America was that you get images like this. Wow. Life imitating art, imitating life. Wow. Yeah, and that's the issue the kid's actually reading. Now notice Captain America has a circular shield in the second issue. Remember the shield? Had his triangular shield? So I found this image, and I was meaning to ask you, Ran, again, is this an authentic Joe Simon sketch that was done to show the lawyers for the Shield who threatened the lawsuit over Captain America? And all they basically agreed to do, and they got away with it, was just to change the shield from the triangle to the circle. So starting in issue 2 and issue 3, you start to see the round shield. And you would think the shield's natural shape is round, but, you know, in history, shields have been triangular. The Superman shield, I mean, that all comes from the sort of triangular shield, but, you know, the circular shield, I mean, Jim Steranko talks about as a kid being so in love with Captain America that they would use the trash can as a shield, and that's how they would fight. But you would think that it was always round from the get-go. What's interesting here about early Kirby is this is early techno Kirby. 20 years later, you get the mature Kirby tech, which is images like this. But back then, those were the seeds to the beginning of it all. Over the course of the next 7 or 8 issues, they did 10 issues, Simon and Kirby. They reintroduced the Red Skull. Here you get one of his great early images of the big head image, which again, 20 years later, you'll see later on in the presentation, when Kirby returns to Captain America in his mature style, you get images like this. And images like this in the Silver Age, you can all find their precedent in those first 10 issues that Simon and Kirby did. And you can see all of the tropes, the big full-page images of the giant figures. Look, the Ringmaster was originally just another Nazi type supervillain, and 20 years later, Kirby brings him back as the Ringmaster minus the Nazi symbol, and he becomes, you know, one of the foundation Marvel villains. Look at this splash page in one of the first 10 issues. I forget which one. Anybody recognize 30 years later Devil Dinosaur that Kirby does in the 70s, a sentimental favorite of many? But look at what Kirby does 20 years earlier with that character. And again, these are the early foundation beginnings of what Kirby would do 20 years later with things like the helicarrier for S.H.I.E.L.D. in 1965 that nobody was doing, that they're still trying to figure out how to do today. Again, early full-page image by Kirby of Captain America and Bucky being feted in some parade. Look at this image from Thor 20 years later, inked by Vince Scaletta, which we'll talk about later, of course, showing a similar scene, but again in Kirby's mature style. Then Kirby maybe creates the double-page spread. Has that been documented?
No.
Other people did double-page spreads? Yeah. Okay, but Kirby really puts double-page spreads on the map, and you can see in this early one the hand reaching over. 20 years later you get that hand reaching over because Kirby became a master of the double page spread image. But again, look at the influence that these early 1941-42 double page spreads might have had on Will Eisner himself, who did images like this 5-6 years later. Look at this Spirit splash page, famous. Eisner loved using the file card as a comic book panel. But look at this 1941 double-page spread where basically Kirby's doing the same exact thing that Eisner was doing. Now they decided, Captain America was so successful and timely, to team Captain America up with the other early Marvel characters like the Submariner and the Human Torch. Obviously this was a knockoff of what DC Comics was doing with their All-Star Comics, in which they pulled together all of their superheroes. Here's a later issue of All Winners with the classic, look again, they're stomping on the 3 dictators there. And this was the cover that was chosen a couple of years ago when Blake Bell and Michael Vasillo did their groundbreaking book about the early years of Marvel Comics. And a lot of it has to do with the chicanery of publisher Martin Goodman, who was Stan Lee's Uncle or cousin? Has that been cleared up? Well, he was older than him, so let's just call him his uncle, because no nepotism there. But the point is this was from some How to Do comics. Where is this from, Ram? I don't even know. I find things in my files.
Writer's Digest, I think.
The point is look at how Martin Goodman is shown here, the publisher, to be the creator of Captain America. And this is just one of the many reasons why, after 10 issues, successful issues, that basically they left Simon and Kirby over money disputes with Goodman, royalties promised on the success of Captain America. Very eerie that 20 years later, the same kind of bugaboos would return about Ditko and Kirby leaving Marvel over also promised royalties that never materialized. So Simon and Kirby, this image is probably from later on, but basically it was their characters that were the soul of Timely Comics that Martin Goodman let go. Here's the stationery masthead. And when they went to DC Comics, they brought some of that Timely Comics attitude, because if you look at the influence that Captain America had, it was only after Captain America that Superman really becomes wedded to the whole, truth, justice, and the American way. All of these images are 1942, 43. They come after Captain America, and Superman begins to fight this proxy war against the Nazi war machine, and all of the other superheroes at the time do the same thing. And this is why superheroes in the war effort were closely tied together. Servicemen read comics because not only were they a four-color distraction away from the mayhem and horror of war around them, but they were quick to read. And that's why comics boomed in the 40s, and the superheroes like this Minuteman and the knockoffs, like what Marvel was doing, just like DC, all their superheroes were fighting what they call the Japan Nazis, some racist mixture of Japanese and Nazis. Even Captain Marvel is fighting the war and introduces Uncle Sam as a comic character, and Uncle Sam gets his own comic at the time. But then what happens when the war ends in 45, and these superheroes that were all wedded to the World War II effort, in a sense, lose their way? You start to get images like this. Superman fighting a domestic war, a far cry from just 2 years earlier, to images like this. All of a sudden, Batman is fighting interplanetary villains. That's a little far from Gotham City. Other genres begin to take over the superhero in the post-war effort. You get the Western in comics like this, Roy Rogers totally dominating. Look at how Green Lantern is a tiny figure on one of the last issues of its own comic, and how big the cowboy is. Look at the second to last issue of All-Star Comics with the title, The Mystery of the Vanishing Detectives. This is also 1950 or so. And then the very next issue of All-Star Comics becomes All-Star Western. The other big genre that replaced the superhero genres in the late 40s and the 50s, of course, are the great horror comics and science fiction comics, crime comics, with the EC brand being the greatest versions of the type. But it was this genre that killed the superhero, and all of a sudden you started to see lighthearted characters like Captain Marvel and Plastic Man dealing with these horrible zombie-like threats. Here is the second to last issue of Captain America's own comic in 1949 called Weird Tales. And by the next issue, I think it was just called Weird Tales completely. So Simon Kirby in the 50s, after the bottom falls out of comics, are looking for other genres to exploit. And single-handedly, they create the romance comic genre. And it becomes like a successful Captain America was, and creates a whole new genre. But they keep wanting to reclaim Captain America. So in 1954, they bring back this knockoff of Captain America called Fighting American, and his Bucky is named Speed Boy the Wonder Kid. Now already you laugh, but these stories were weird kind of humorous, spoofy, parodic knockoffs of more serious superhero stories. And I don't know, is this all Joe Simon? I mean, where did this whole angle come from to sort of approach it like this, to try to make fun of the 1950s communist threat? So you get Poison Ivan and Hotsky Trotsky. You can't make this stuff up. But here's Kirby's 1950s action comic style with his Captain America knockoff of Fighting American. It was only 10 years later, when Kirby hits his mature style, that you get Captain America pages like this that show you how his figures became denser and blockier and more dynamic. Fighting American lasts a couple more issues between 54 and 55 with covers like this and stories like this. It veers off into total fantasy. By the way, notice how by May of 55 they joined the club, the self-censoring board of the Comics Code, and this is what basically cleaned up comics in the middle 50s because of the accusations that those crime and horror comics were causing juvenile delinquency, which is of course the subject of a whole nother discussion. But suffice it to say that during the 50s, during a time of the Red Scare and comics causing juvenile delinquency, this was the spirit of the time of the mid-50s when they decided to bring Captain America back. But this time, if you look at the first cover from May of 1955, you see at the top that now he's a commie smasher. And also, look at the upper left corner, Timely Comics has now become Atlas Comics. And these are the early covers. They only did 3 issues in 1955, and it was all about the communists as being the threat. So you've got images like this from the splash pages. You know, the artist Neil Adams, when I worked for him, told me that when he was a teenager growing up in the 50s, he said, we were taught that the communists were worse than the Nazis. So that's why you get images like this with the communist threat being portrayed, you know, in such a way as the villain in every issue. And by the way, the artist for this wasn't Jack Kirby. Look at the signature there. That is a young John Romita doing Captain America. Now, you might know John Romita, of course, from being the iconic later 60s Spider-Man artist after the original Spider-Man artist Steve Ditko leaves in 1966. A lot of people don't remember that in the Silver Age, he does a few issues of Captain America. And it was in the 70s, when Kirby leaves Marvel, that Romita becomes, along with John Buscema, really the sort of generic face of Marvel Comics, where he ends up doing images of Captain America like this, that end up becoming the images that become associated with the character in the 1970s. Speaking of which, when Kirby returns to Captain America, to Marvel Comics in the middle 70s, Romita was there to basically make Captain America look more like Romita than Jack Kirby. Here is the pencil of Kirby's first issue in 1975 when he returns to Marvel Comics after 5 years of being at rival DC. But look at Romita's inks, and you can see how he was told, because he was the company art director. He didn't do anything unless he was told to do. He was told to make that face look more like Romita than like Kirby. Yeah, take a look at that again. That's what I'm talking about. Horrible. Real desecration. And, of course, he signs his name as the inker. But this was all in the future, back in 1955, when John Romita does these 3 issues of Captain America. Why did these fail? Why is this not considered the beginning of the Silver Age? It's 1955. It's a year before DC Comics does The Flash in 1956, which is considered to be the kickoff of the Silver Age. What is the difference between this Flash and the original Flash that you don't see in the 1950s reboot of Captain America? What I'm getting at is that when they tried to bring back Captain America, they brought him back the same way, and it failed. The real genius to what DC Comics does to kick off the Silver Age is that, you know how we talk about reboots now in pop culture? Everything gets rebooted. Well, the first American pop culture reboot is the rebooting of the Flash, because the stroke of genius was not to bring the Flash back in the same costume, but was to give him a new look, a new identity. So it kept the name of the Flash, the power, but it gave him a new look. So they do another one. They take Green Lantern. This is Gil Kane, sleek, late 50s Green Lantern. But look at the original Green Lantern from the 40s, showing the costume design back then. Baggier costumes like magician's cloaks. Can you imagine if they had brought this back in 1959? It probably would have died. Anyway, in the mid-50s, here's a picture of Kirby and Simon. They're again looking for new genres to explore because sales are down, because of the comics code, and all comic artists and writers are desperate. Simon comes up with the name of this character, Spider-Man. He actually creates this logo, but the only early image we have of the Joe Simon Spider-Man is a couple of pages of this character called the Silver Spider, and the art style, if you're a comic book art aficionado, you might recognize as that of the great Captain Marvel artist C.C. Beck. And it's about a teenager that has a magic ring, there's the spider logo, and he lives with his parents, so there's some elements that you'll recognize later. But after Simon and Kirby split up, this is still while he's with Simon. There's a couple of proposal images for this next iteration called Night Fighter, which is a character you can see from the second proposal image where he can walk on walls with those kind of suction cup things. Now this character most resembles the 1959 character that Simon and Kirby do for Archie Comics called The Fly. And here Kirby resurrects that double-page spread that he had. Look at how there's a spider villain. The reason why this is all important is because, according to Steve Ditko, who drew this in 1990, that the original Spider-Man that writer, editor, and co-creator Stan Lee claims he gave to Kirby to draw, and when Stan Lee gave those pencil pages to Ditko to ink, Ditko said it resembles too much The Fly. This is Ditko's recollection of what that image looked like. Now, the story's been that Kirby took it away from, Lee took those early Spider-Man pages that looked like this away from Kirby because he felt that they were too Kirby, too bulky, and he wanted that teenager look. And that's why he gave Spider-Man to Ditko, and of course, the rest is history. So that's a little sort of tangent, because in 1959, the other character that Simon and Kirby create for Archie Comics is yet another knockoff of Captain America. Look at these interesting little kind of like flip book images that Rand has pasted up on the wall right above where he's sitting right now. But there's the full page spread explaining, actually this is a reboot of the character, the Shield. Archie had the rights to the Shield, so it's called the Private Life, the Double Life of Private Strong. So, and he's got superpowers this time. And it's kind of crazy. It only lasts 2 issues because DC Comics actually threatened with a lawsuit because they felt that the superpowers that this character has, and again, it was confusing. In some logos, it's the Double Life of Private Strong, and then in other logos in those 2 issues, it's called the Shield, and there is yet another knockoff of Bucky called Pee-wee? Are you kidding me? Yes, Pee-wee. Anyway, that's the end for the Simon-Kirby partnership. They go their separate ways, and Kirby wanders over to Atlas Comics and teams up with Stanley Lieber, changed his name to Stan Lee, and they were still known as Atlas Comics back then. And in 1959, when Kirby returns to Marvel Comics, DC Comics is the king of the road. It's their comics that dominate the newsstand in kind of racks like this in the early 60s. And they took all of those rebooted superheroes and brought them together in the Justice League of America. And this was very successful to the point where Martin Goodman, the publisher over at Atlas, who was always looking at what was successful in order to knock it off, basically says to Lee and Kirby, we got to knock off the Justice League of America, so can't we take some of our characters and bring them together and revamp them a little? So in the fall of '61, you get the Foundation comics of Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four #1. Again, rebooted from the 1940s. The Invisible Girl, like the Invisible Man, public domain. The Thing is just like all the monsters that they were doing at the time. And Mr. Fantastic is a knockoff of Plastic Man who hadn't been published. And as long as they didn't call him Plastic, they were able, obviously, to have the same power. Then comes the Hulk. That's successful up to a point. After 6 issues, they discontinue him. But he's a fixture in the Marvel Universe. Then Kirby comes up with Thor. And that's in 1962, the same month that Spider-Man debuts in Amazing Fantasy 15 in '62. In '63 comes Iron Man, and these are the core heroes of the Marvel Comics universe that they bring together in September of 1963 as the Avengers superhero group, which was them trying to do a rebooted version of the previous Marvel Comics gathering. So, they got everybody but Captain America. So obviously, Lee and Kirby decide sometime in the summer or fall of '63 to start to bring back Captain America into the new Marvel Comics universe. But notice, even the colorist wasn't sure what to do in places, and colorist Trump's wrong. But this is the first Silver Age appearance of the Kirby Captain America in November of 1963. And it's drawn by Jack Kirby with his early '60s inker, Dick Ayers? Dick Ayers. And I don't particularly like his inking. I describe it as like a wooden stick dipped in mud. But again, art is subjective. Everybody has their preferences. But these little trial balloons in the fall of '63 were obviously successful. But remember the date of this comic? November of '63. Gee, what happened in November of 1963? This little event happened. And this profoundly affected Jack Kirby. In a recent article in the Jack Kirby Collector, there's a great story, right? A couple issues ago, about how Kirby was so effective, like really the rest of America, obviously, but Kirby as a veteran, as somebody that loved America and loved freedom and everything, basically took it upon himself to really feel the need to bring back Captain America fully into the Marvel Universe as a kind of proxy replacement for President Kennedy. So in March of 1964, which again comes out in late December, January of '64, and there is the first Silver Age appearance. You know, this cover has become such an icon. It's Jack Kirby, inked by maybe my least favorite inker of all time, George Russo. I could do a whole anti-lecture about George Russo. But suffice it to say that I think his inks are terrible, and I'll show you a little bit later on. But it's always nice to see a modern comic artist take that iconic cover and do it their own way. This is Steve Rude paying homage to that cover. This is a guy I know from Facebook that makes giant stained glass images of comic book covers. I mean, this is probably about the size of that projection right now. Of course, the great Alex Ross has taken so many early Kirby images and done them in his classic, realistic style. Anyway, in that issue, they bring Captain America back. Here's the splash page. In the story, if you're familiar with the origin, the Submariner finds a man trapped in a block of ice in the Arctic, and it thaws out, and the Avengers and their submarine discover it, and they bring him back, and the Wasp recognizes that poorly inked drawing as Captain America. Yes, thank you. George Russo, hate him. You know his nickname was Inky Russo?
Yeah.
I call him Stinky Russo because of pages like this. And again, why is this bad inking? We'll talk about that a little later on. But Captain America revives, and he has to prove to the Avengers that he's the real Captain America. So in the beginning of Kirby's mature style, we begin to see the primer-like acrobatics that Kirby puts on the printed page. and this is maybe the first example of it, but because it's inked by George Russo, you have no way of knowing how good the pencils actually were. And they want to know, but how come you haven't aged? Well, this is going to be the story of Captain America in the Silver Age that Kirby begins to tell. So Captain America is an immediate success in the Avengers, and later on, that fall, this image comes out, classic Kirby slugfest, again, one of the foundation images that became known as the whole Marvel style. See, at DC Comics, the DC Comics superheroes liked each other. They hung out. At Marvel Comics, the heroes fought each other. It's really like this is the beginning of exhibition wrestling. It's like you knew they really weren't going to kill each other, but that's one of the real groundbreaking appeals of Marvel Comics. So this was Iron Man's solo title in October of 1964. The very next month, because this was like another trial balloon to see would people buy Tales of Suspense with Iron Man to read Captain America. Well, in the very next issue we got the answer, because in this iconic Kirby cover, you know, he didn't get to draw Iron Man that much. The Iron Man story on the wall here is like one of Kirby's foundation Marvel Comics stories, the slugfest between Iron Man and Submariner. He only drew Iron Man on a few covers, but anytime he drew him iconically. But that's the only interior that Kirby ever did of both the Submariner and Iron Man. And it's from 1966, the beginning of Kirby's peak mature style. And it's really, if you haven't seen that issue, you talk about combat combatives. Every panel in that story on the wall is all about combatives between two of the great Marvel characters. This image introducing the fact that they're splitting the title into two separate stories, each featuring character, that image of Captain America became one of the icons of Captain America, and Kirby did a handful of them, but this was the image that they chose for the recent stamp that they reissued. And when you opened up the comic, this idea of Captain America bursting from behind that kind of thin paper wall behind him is really amped up in the splash page image when you got to that point in that first issue. And this is what it looked like whole. And what we see here is the beginning of the inks by Chick Stone, who is I would call him a sentimental favorite of many Kirby aficionados. He debuts inking Kirby in 1964. Personally, it's really the beginning of me liking Jack Kirby's art. I didn't like it before, inked by Ayers or the 50s stuff or the 40s stuff. But what you'll begin to see with Chick Stone, he comes on board as Kirby hits his mature style, and he gives Kirby's bold action figures what I call this almost magic marker outline that you're going to see as I take you through these foundation stories and Tales of Suspense from late 64 and 65 that really become the core foundation of why Kirby said Captain America was his favorite character to draw. Now you'd think it would be all about action, but Kirby's hidden genius is that he was able to draw characters in repose as much as he was able to draw them in heightened action. You know, even when the guys are getting their asses kicked, they're still getting their asses kicked in a hyper-dramatic pose that doesn't make them look silly. It's kind of like Sean Connery in Bond films. Even when he was getting beat up, he looked cool. When Roger Moore was getting beat up, he looked goofy. But Sean Connery, even getting beat up, looked cool. But Kirby was able to pull off very sensitive images like this that you don't normally associate with Kirby. Look at the images at the bottom here of how he's recollecting his young partner from the 40s, Bucky, who died. Look at the body language. Another artist might have shown you a close-up of Captain America's face, maybe tearing up or whatever. But Kirby chose to show you the hulked, sulky, whatever you want to describe, that beautiful drawing on the right side. But that brings Stan Lee's dialogue to life or should I say Stan Lee's dialogue, matched what Kirby drew out like a silent film on paper before Lee dialogues it. You turn the page and you're thrust into Kirby action against a band of bad guys. These are the foundation stories of the Silver Age Captain America, and how Jack Kirby takes you through a veritable catalog of comic book fight scenes that are pure Kirby, which are really the mature versions of fight scenes like this that he does 20 years later, maintaining the same basic panel design, very simple. Kirby believes in the proscenium arch idea of comic book art, in which it's not about the crazy shaped panels, it's about the art inside the panel, like when you're watching a stage play. You're not aware, right, Bill Coulter, theater drama teacher at Brooklyn High School? You know, you're supposed to focus on what's going on the stage, and that's called the proscenium arch idea. And Kirby, as you'll see, especially with Captain America, is a big believer in what's going on inside the panel that he wants you, the reader, to focus on. So these Captain America definitive action images, which again, when inked by Chick Stone in that bold magic marker line, become this primer-like quality of where Kirby is showing all future artists, if you want to do action, if you want to do tension, if you want to do drama with the human figure, what did Kirby do? Remember, folks, as Robert Crumb would say, it's only lines on paper. And yet, look at the lines in both the figure, the motion line. This is what cartooning is. The idea of adding a few motion lines, but look how they echo the lines of the figure, so you feel that. You might not have been tied up, maybe some of you have been, but you know what that feels like. And then look at that last panel. Look how you can feel the tension in that image, and yet it's lines on paper, but it feels like it's moving. Then, as a storyteller, you turn the page, and the tension gets released like a coiled spring, and Kirby draws Captain America leaping. Now, I could do a whole nother lecture comparing other comic artists of the day and why nobody was doing figures leaping and positions like this that, again, only Kirby knew from fighting in the Lower East Side and in World War II about actions like this. Maybe you've seen those things in movies like Kirby might have done. Who knows? But again, when you look at these foundation images, you see what made Captain America great. Kirby said it was all about movement. Look at this middle panel. Look at that figure of Captain America darting across the panel. It's almost abstract. And you recognize that in the work of the great Batman artist Bruce Timm of the animated series, who is a Kirby aficionado like the rest of us. Only Bruce Timm, along with maybe Steve Rude, knows how to get the Kirby dynamic in their artwork without slavishly imitating Kirby. So you could see the Kirby in the Bruce Timm figure in the second story that Kirby does in Tales of Suspense. And again, look at those Chick Stone bold magic marker outlines. Look at that figure. You know, again, who knows if that's what Kirby penciled, if he interpreted that way, whatever. If these muscles are really correct, it doesn't matter. This isn't Neil Adams' proper anatomy. This is hyper-exaggerated, stylized anatomy, which is what Kirby is all about, and why when Chick Stone inked him, that sort of primer-like quality comes across. They almost look like children's book drawings, but in a sense sophisticated children's book drawings by an adult. But you feel that energy in that top panel. Again, Kirby gives you the traffic signs for shield throwing in these early stories. This is why when people go to the movies and see Captain America throwing his shield, and, you know, there's only a tiny credit at the end of the film, Captain America created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, people have no way of knowing that just the idea of Captain America throwing his shield as a weapon, that didn't come from Stan Lee. That came out of the mind of the artist, of Jack Kirby, in pages and panels like this. look at what he does with the shield in these top 4 panels. I mean, it's really a riot, but again, it's Kirby giving you the foundation of that shield in incredibly powerful images like this that just are all about motion and energy. So Captain America's immediate success in Tales of Suspense. In the fall of '64, they teamed Captain America up with Sergeant Fury. Now, Sergeant Fury was Jack Kirby's World War II character. The previous issue, issue 12, in November of '64, is of course a classic Kirby image of his, maybe it's a knockoff of Sergeant Rock at DC, we don't know, but it's interesting that the war begins to creep into Captain America. This is January of 1965, and they have a story, look at that title, about Vietnam. Now you got to remember, that means this is being written and produced in the fall of '64, right after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Most Americans didn't even hear about Vietnam until the end of 1965. So this foundation story, which opens up with a splash page with this incredible image, once again, the thick magic marker outlines of Chick Stone really make that Kirby character literally leap off the page. Delineator extraordinaire, says Stan Lee's credit boxes. But Stan Lee had the foresight, or Jack Kirby did, we don't know for sure, but the idea in late '64 and early '65 of having the Marvel Comics superheroes actually in Vietnam, fighting again that proxy war, just like the war heroes fought in World War II. DC Comics wasn't doing this, Marvel Comics was doing it. That's why the Marvel Comics characters were embraced by the counterculture in magazine covers like this. This was the English version of Rolling Stone in October '69, not too long after this little independent film was released. And its lead character, played by Peter Fonda, of course, is named Captain America. And it was images like that in Vietnam that made Captain America a hero of the counterculture. But again, you know, the forward motion of Captain America that Kirby puts across in these stories in Tales of Suspense in that first year are really, again, pretty startling. And once again, notice the bold outlines of Chick Stone. Here's another great page that again shows that primer-like quality of Kirby's Captain America. I mean, these are images in their symmetry, isolated in the square panels, almost become like traffic signs for that particular effect. In March of '65, they decide to tell Captain America's origin to a whole new readership. This image became one of the iconic images of Captain America that we've seen again in merchandising and everywhere. You opened it up to the splash page, and now we see the debut of a new inker named Frank Ray, except Frank Ray wasn't his name. His name was Frank Giacoia. But back then, DC and Marvel didn't want to know that any of their artists were working for the other company. It was very much like the William Randolph Hearst thing, where the Pulitzer didn't want to know anything about what, you know, Hearst was doing at the New York World. So they had to use pseudonyms in 1965 in order to work for the other company. But people like Frank Giacoia's inks on Kirby's pencils, and we'll see them in this new phase of Kirby's Captain America work. But it's really interesting to look back at how Kirby's mature style in 20 years went from this in 1941 to the same story in 1965, and you get the bulked up version of Steve Rogers and Captain America, again inked by Frank Giacoia, that we've come to know as Kirby's mature style. Look at the way Kirby's Captain America makes his debut in this full page image of wham pow action. Compare this to 20 years earlier for Captain America's debut image in 1941. But that same energy in the fight scenes that I showed you in the early Captain America was just one-upped by Kirby in his more mature style in the mid-60s. So you get incredible panels like this that we see echoed in the very next issue when they decide to bring back the great Red Skull in issue 65, in May of 65. Now, another colorist, I forget his name, took these foundation issues and colored them in the more modern computer coloring style. So the splash page looks like this versus the comic book standard Ben-Day dot coloring, which I kind of prefer. All the projects I've done are like that. Look at how he pays homage to that early giant head image. In this particular story, look at these top panels. The reason why I love these is because this is the type of action that Kirby innately understood how the body moves. I don't really believe there's photo reference for these type of images. I don't think Kirby worked from photo reference. This is all out of his head. But in a way, it comes from his upbringing right here in the Lower East Side where he grew up. This is a self-portrait, an autobiographical story he does in 1990, towards the end of his life, called Street Code. And it's one of the greatest things Kirby's ever drawn. And it's about growing up in the Lower East Side and the fights that he would have with his friends and the other gangs on the rooftops, right here, right around where we're talking right now. But you see the energy of these fight scenes that Kirby experienced firsthand as a kid, echoed, without the blood and the gore, obviously, in these Foundation Captain America scenes. Like this one, especially, I love at the bottom. Anyway, that same month that the Red Skull is brought back, that is the month that this image appears, in which Captain America becomes the leader of the Avengers in issue 16. Now, ever since he debuted in issue number 4, whenever Captain America was featured on the cover, he'd be one of the minor characters. But as the Avengers progress, Captain America starts inching his way to the front, to the point where by issue 15, the previous issue, look at how prominent he is in the bottom of the cover. So it wasn't that much of a leap to go from this in one month in 1965 to this the next month, where he becomes the not only leader of the Avengers, but really the leader of the Marvel Comics universe. When they start merchandising Marvel Comics in 1965, there's Captain America leading the Avengers in that new lineup. Now, the very next issue of Tales of Suspense is this cover, and look at what Stan Lee writes down below. If one picture is worth 1,000 words, just imagine what these two pictures are worth. And you know what? This is one case where I would have to agree with Stan Lee. I think he's right. This ended up being the long-awaited origin of the Red Skull. Look, all new, never before revealed. And in this story, which picks up midway, where the Red Skull and his goons have Captain America captured, and once again, look at the naturalism of the characters in the chairs there. You know, you want to tell young comic artists, it's one thing to draw figures coming at you foreshortened with big fists, but if you really want to know the mark of a good artist, ask them to draw people sitting in a chair. Ask them to draw two people eating breakfast at a table. Kirby was able to do scenes like this, as well as scenes like this, that make you feel the action and the power. So as the Red Skull begins to tell his story to Captain America, and we go into flashback of him as a child between the wars, well, this little story, if you know the story of the Red Skull, you know, he's an orphan, he's beat up, he's abused, he's in jail. But basically, this is the story that could only have come from the mind and the soul and the experience that Jack Kirby must have gotten in Europe, seeing the death and devastation there. That's why when he brings it back, just like a whole generation of great American artists like Norman Mailer and Rod Serling brought back their war experiences into the pop culture and created the novels and the TV shows, so too did Kirby bring back that World War II experience and invest it, and that's why the stories of Hitler and the Red Skull and scenes like this have a veracity to them, a truthfulness to them, a realness to them, even with the cartoonier bold ace of Chick Stone. This might be the first 4-panel full-page sequence that I was able to find of Kirby's Captain America work. It's a motif he would return to for the rest of his career, obviously, but this is, I think, the first time. And once again, look at how each figure of Captain America is an icon for that type of motion, that type of figure. I mean, it takes balls to draw that kind of trajectory and make you kind of agree with it and understand it, right? It kind of shouldn't make sense, but it does, because it's Jack Kirby. It's Jack Kirby being the definitive superhero action artist. Back to the inks of Frank Ray, aka Frank Giacoia, in the next couple of issues, still there as Frank Ray. All of a sudden, in the middle of 1965, we get this issue, issue 69, and it doesn't look right. Is that Kirby? Wait, it's layouts by Jack Kirby, and the finished drawing and inking by Dick Ayers. Now, of course, Dick Ayers was the War Comics artist. His inking is right there on the wall. He starts doing the finishes over Kirby's layouts because Kirby is busy drawing every other Marvel comic cover and Fantastic Four and Thor and X-Men. And as Marvel booms, so they decide for Kirby just to do the covers and the layouts. Well, starting in issue 70, they have done away with the split cover, and Kirby does some incredible covers. But then you open up to the story, and you get now layouts by Kirby with finished art by George Tuska, who was a Golden Age artist that Stan Lee brought back into the Marvel fold. The problem is that the art, even if the layouts were by Kirby, see, Kirby could make a boring 6-panel layout work by treating it like a primer and having incredible action. So even if he laid it out, even if the layouts are somewhat Kirby, the art still looks dull and flat because it's not Kirby, that's George Tuska. The problem is that the animators who were working on these new Marvel cartoons that were going to debut in 1966, these were the stories they were using to adapt for those funky cartoons. This is a blow-up of an inset of this article that appears in 1966 just when the cartoons debut, about the backstory and how they did them. This is the first page of the article. And to return back to where I was before, so the problem is the actual page this animator's working on, that panel, ends up becoming this image on the screen. So they would advertise the thing in the ads in 1966 using Kirby's artwork, which of course was also, again, taken from that great iconic image and used on the sales brochure material that this is the cover of to try to convince advertisers to buy ad space. Here's actually the back cover of the brochure material, and you can see the pitch using comic book lettering and everything. And there's a double-page spread insert. So yeah, once in a while they would actually use Kirby penciled art. This is from later on when Kirby returns to doing the pencils. But it's a mixed bag. We were able to get Captain America onto the screen, and it's all about Captain America throwing that mighty, mighty shield. Oh wait, Sam.
His mighty shield, all those who chose to oppose his shield must yield. It is led to a fight, and the duel is due, and the red and the white and the blue come through when Captain America throws his mighty